Hello, everyone. Welcome back to What Matters Most. I am very, very excited to have today with us Meron Gribetz. He's a new friend of mine. He's the CEO of Inner Cosmos, a brain-computer interface company doing pretty incredible work, which I hope we get to talk to about. He's also a student and amateur of Kabbalah, experiences spirituality and a practitioner of consciousness, as maybe we've mentioned before. He likes
Very
to
amateur
surf.
Kabbalah-wise, because I just turned 40. Keep that in mind.
Okay. That's at least the right age, right, to traditionally
Exactly,
start.
when you're supposed to start.
Exactly. And you got married, which is also supposed to be, right, like a thing.
Big spiritual catalyst for sure.
And so very excited to have you, Meron. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So I'm just gonna kick off as we do usually and ask you what matters most to you.
What matters most to me is cognitive powers, our cognition as humans. And I'm going to go through what that means over the course of today. But the concept that we should be cleaning our vessel and our consciousness to a point where we can be very, very present and focused on what matters most. For me, that means a connection with my loved ones, which includes God, includes my wife, my new wife, includes, my colleagues, and includes myself. So to have a really strong cognitive vessel to be able to do that is what matters. I feel that our evolution, our brains evolved in monkey savanna-like speeds of information processing. Basically, where's my next source of food? How do I find a mate, and how to avert danger? It's a very narrow cognitive bandwidth. Whereas in modernity, we get like 2 to 3 books worth of audiovisual information thrown at us every day through our mobile devices and computers. And it's not just like, some clean content. It's sugary content that's designed to make our dopaminergic system, spike, and it's designed to be fragmented. So we're fragmenting our cognition. And so, it's only getting worse also, if you look at how technology is evolving right now. And so I really strive to build technologies that help you refocus your cognitive powers and realign, so you can be more present with your loved ones, yourself, your work, your mission in this life. And that's really the basis. That's why I came up with, or started this company of Inner Cosmos, which is a brain-computer interface. I have it here in my hand for cognition, initially for patients with depression, because depression is a cognitive disorder. Your cognition is unable to focus outwards and it's stuck inwards. You can't focus outwards through a brain network called cognitive control network. So you're focusing inwards in a brain network called default mode network, which is where your rumination, that voice that goes over and over, how your boss screwed you at work, or your, spouse, upset you. And so this brain-computer interface, as you introduced at the beginning, it basically, it's actually the smallest brain-computer interface by volume. It's about 5 times smaller than Neuralink, Elon's, BCI. And it's much less invasive. It's the least invasive out of the BCI companies. It goes under your skin, but inside of your skull. So you don't penetrate through the skull. And then it's doing what's called neuromodulation, or basically realigning your brain networks that govern cognition. And so the idea is that we're living in a time that is taxing our cognition so much and getting us out of presence, network, the brain network of presence is called cognition. And so we can build tools to strengthen cognition, initially to get patients out of their inner world network and into the focused outside world. But eventually to help, you know, all, all humans and healthy humans basically increase the quality of their cognition, um, which for us spiritualists really means to widen our bandwidth, to be able to be present with different elements,
Yeah.
including God, our soul, all that.
I definitely connect to that a lot in the sense of like, you know, a energy flows where your focus goes. There's like a small sentence, I think it's like this or something similar, but like, right, like it's one of the most important resources we have, our attention, right? And as we know from the study of Kabbalah, like time is not linear as we imagine, and we have experienced so far, right? Like God and spirituality in the soul transcends that and lives in the eternal present moment, which is inherently a single moment of attention, right? That's what presence for us sort of means. What I think is interesting, and like how I think about this sort of aspect of evolution in the cognitive function and so on, is like I'm kind of convinced to a certain level that the need for this type of increasing cognitive function and of like ability to process data is kind of a result of the fact that, right, like our soul inherently has access to infinite knowledge, right? And so like when like, God infused consciousness as we know it and experience it in Adam, we went from like monkey being to like full human, conscious aware being, which is interesting. But we still don't really know what the difference is. Like if you ask anybody on the street, like, no, we're just animals with something else, but I don't know how to explain, right? And I think interestingly, AI and technologies is making us question that again in a deeper level. I think you specifically with your work is like touching, really playing the boundary of that, right?
Yeah.
Um,
By the way, there's also a shadow to the movement away from animals. Spiritualists often feel that animals are closer to God because they're channeling energy without the like ego to
totally.
interface and block it and remodel it. So if their feeling is a direct channel, whereas we have all this complexity once we ate from Etz Hadat, and
Correct.
the tree of knowledge, good and bad. We kind of moved out of the animalistic simplicity and naivete into like over analyzing, um, you know, over intellectualizing, over labeling, and
Yeah.
things. And so maybe it's like we got access to that infinite amount of knowledge, but we didn't have the vessel. We didn't have the way to contain it. And so it turned into like all this ego control. The first thing about Adam and Eve after that point was like, the concept of covering the body and like feeling ashamed of that, and understanding that I'm separate from that other person and the tree and like all this separation. So I think I mean, this is like total tangent on spirituality, but I think as we evolve, back into that, into the state of being able to hold all that knowledge, as possibly we did before that moment, uh, I think AI and brain computer interfaces have the capacity to help you get and process a lot more knowledge and do so in a way that you can handle. So you don't actually have to develop all these like mechanisms of defense and complexity in the world to process it. So it's a bit esoteric. So I think we
Yeah,
should
no,
definitely
that's
ground it. But like at a high level, I think, look, right now we're in a world that's really fragmented, really polarized. These are obvious things. I'm not the first to say them. Our egos have gone to the most extreme state of identification, separation. in some sense, if we keep coming back to this, like, that moment of the etzadat, the tree of knowledge, where the ego was born, you know, on a Kabbalistic spiritual perspective, we've now accentuated it to the most extreme state. And now it's time to fix it. And that's what we're doing, essentially. How do we build tools to help people be present, be reconnect, and realign all of their
Realign.
fragmentation?
Yeah. Coherence is the word that I'm like feeling right now. It's like there's this inherent coherence in the world that we need to realign with, and that's what we lost when it's a that, and we're still like every generation is still fixing part of that consequence.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
so how do you specifically work through this challenge of distraction in such an overstimulated world, in a world where like I feel like I at least experience a sort of need to run, and like it's hard to just stop and be and not do, right? Like how do you balance this duality inside of you in order to find that presence for you to be able to be compassionate and be present for your loved ones, which like
Yeah.
I think it could extend all the way to like I'm having a conversation with someone, I'm fully present and I'm not like imagining the things that I need to do later, right? Like
Yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of work to be fully present in this day and age. Our tools are somewhat working against us in the way they deliver information in a cognitive overload kind of fashion. So I think it becomes increasingly important to meditate in the morning, which, for us Jews, that means 10 minutes of shacharit, perhaps.
yeah.
It includes, I like this guided meditation tool called Happier, which, is just an app on the App Store that I've been doing without missing a day pretty much for 10 years in my spiritual journey.
Wow.
Um,
It's powerful.
yes, I think it's great for, the fragmented mind, because it gives you a different guided meditation every day that is very grounded. It's by, teachers that have brought mindfulness into this country. They don't, there's not a lot of ego there. There's not a lot of like woo, you know, bigness. It's very grounded and beautiful. So that's my plug for Happier. I hope they give me
A percentage.
so, and then I think for me specifically, it's about also handling my physical body in a way that is in alignment with evolution. So, that requires a lot of work on, I run when I have key meetings, maybe 3 times a day, 3 times a week, and I surf 3 times a week, when I'm in the right place. And I think
So
that's
what do you
critical
mean? What do you
because
mean concretely though about like aligning with evolution? Do you mean like the sort of the idea of not losing functionalities or kind of can you paint that picture a little bit more clearly, sir?
yeah, absolutely. So it means arranging the biochemistry of the brain in a way that, evolutionarily we're used to. So we're used to running through the savannah for a few hours a day, or moving our bodies. And that creates, cocktail of neurotransmitters in the brain, dopamine, serotonin, and
Yeah.
all the rest of them that allows for focused, for cognition to thrive. And so I'm going to accelerate that process into a 15-minute run or an hour and a half, so that for the rest of my day, I have enough dopamine to be present and focused. So that's
Yeah.
versus like the opposite of that is not doing that and expending that same dopamine on social media, and
Yeah.
just like those micro like dopamine spurts that occur with every one of these sugary pieces of content exhaust your
Sure.
reserve of them, and so you're unable to be focused and present.
That's
So
very
anyway,
interesting way of putting it.
that's my regimen in the morning, and it's a lot. It's like
Yeah.
45 minutes of meditation, prayer, and then it's exercise. And then I find that I'm able to really be present in the conversations and for my loved ones. Um, but it's not enough for the rest of the billions of people on the planet that haven't had access to the teachers and the spiritual tools that enable that. And perhaps they're even beyond a threshold of lack of presence. We call it anxiety or depression, that
Yeah.
they can't really be helped with these tools. Like for example, severely depressed patients that are at home sleeping most of the day for a few decades. These are the people I work with in my day job. And
This is where you do the like implants. You're aiming to do
yeah,
implants
this is
for
where you do
like
brain stimulation or,
I see.
uh, other modalities of treating the brain to get them back into cognitive balance so that they can be present to even begin the process of cultivating, their cognition in the way that I can. Um, so I think I work on cognition on myself in these ways and for my patients in technological intervention kind of ways.
How did you like as a neuroscientist sort of like come to understand, because you have your right like belief system and spiritual layer, and there's this question of what makes us human versus machines that we were like kind of touching upon before, and the threshold and so on. How did you come to understand or believe that you could combine them, that like
Yeah.
machine technology, computer technology can truly enhance your actual conscious experience?
Yeah. Um, that's a beautifully framed question. I would say that it started from my childhood and it was an evolving understanding of how the brain works. I have like the spiritualist in me and I have the reductionist in me, like the scientist that really looks at it in a biological organ kind of simple, grounded way. And that side of me understands the brain as a computer and the computer
Mm,
is a brain. And they're just in different levels of complexity, right? They're both molecular in nature.
sure.
They're both some kind of a computation substrate. And so, in the simplest possible way, if this is a computer and I'm pointing at my computer as a computer, then there's a way to interface them so that it can become a tool to enhance each other and to and so but the realization came from growing up in Jerusalem with ADHD, and mom gets really, concerned that I'm like not like the rest of the kids and gets the best neurologist in town and he prescribes, doesn't make eye contact with me and he looks at my charts and he goes, okay, well, take this take this drug,
Phil.
which this pill, which is 70 years old, by the way, and it's going to fix you, but don't tell anybody about it, lest it affect your reputation. And, and I never saw this person again. That was like the, that's how it began. So for my whole childhood, I was taking this molecule called Ritalin, and many people know its cousin Adderall. And from almost getting kicked out of school, in 2 years, I was head of the student council and taught my class and got into the best unit, one of the best units in the Israeli intelligence, and then got into Columbia University. So thank you, Ritalin. So in some sense, what the oracle said, this neurologist said, was right. And on another sense, there was a shadow side where every year that I was taking it, I was losing more and more of my friends. And it's not the nerd effect because I was a nerd before this, and a very social one. Uh, it was some kind of a side effect, a dark side effect I wasn't understanding. But by the time I'm at Columbia University and I'm academically safe, I'm like, okay, I'm kicking this drug. Um, it's just not worth that trade off. And then the most remarkable thing happened. Okay, 50% of our student body over the years that I was there eventually started asking me or people like me for our stash of Ritalin, which I'm, you know, was trying to get rid of. Um, so these are like 1,600 SAT, the most focused and
Yeah.
brilliant people in the country on some level. And why are they asking me for focus drugs? And
Yeah.
in hindsight, it was the first 3 years of Facebook on campus. So it makes sense. Cognitions were getting
Started to be
fragmented.
distracted.
Yeah, starting to get addicted and distracted. Nobody knew what was going on back then, but this
Yeah.
was the beginning. And it wasn't just depression. I mean, it wasn't just attention drugs. It was also depression drugs and anxiety drugs. Probably 25% of the student body was on one form of those two classes. And they have even more stark trade-offs, like you're getting a superpower in antidepressants, which is you're blunting your low moods, so you don't experience as deep
The
negative
deep.
moods. But you're also blunting your high moods,
So
emotional
you're not
blunting is a
experiencing
side
happiness and
strong
joy.
states of joy and excitement and creativity. And of course, there's for antidepressants. Fortunately, I've never had to use them. But there's suicidality when you switch cocktails. There's mental fog and fatigue. There's libido side effects. I mean, it's a really tough thing that so many people are experiencing, and it's ultimately a 50-year-old molecule.
It
It's
feels
like
like at a collective
changes.
level, it feels like at a collective level, it's like monotonizing. There's this uniform layer of mood and energy and experience.
Yeah, that's right. That's a well put, framework. And when I was seeing this major trade off, the way I would classify it is you're getting a superpower, but you're losing a big piece of your humanity. Okay, so that's the trade off. And so I went on to I was like, okay, there's a huge trend here because if you look at the numbers, you know, um, there's a there's just a big piece of our society that's using these things. And it's almost like a consumer level trend that's not being spoken about because of taboo. And I set out to kind of like study the brain, become a neuroscientist, understand, the modern understanding of the brain, because I had a strong sense that it's not a chemical imbalance as, the last 50 years of neuroscience thought. I'm talking about when I was at Columbia, in the early 2000s, but it's something else. And what I discovered is that the brain is an electrochemical organ with the emphasis on electro, and we compute in action potentials, very similar to ones and zeros with
Yeah, yeah,
some distinction. And so the way to fix these brain states and to ultimately improve cognition for both patients with ADHD, depression, anxiety, is to interface with
the
that
electrical
on that
level.
level, on the electric level. And indeed, we see that electrical
Interesting.
interventions don't have the side effects. They have higher efficacy than drugs. They're just not very well known because of various dynamics that I can explain. But there's some super, super powerful things. And so that journey towards like, healing my own cognition and understanding it is what led me to ultimately see that there's a big piece of the puzzle in interfacing between the brain and the machine. And that's something that, my career really became about. Yeah.
Yeah,
Secularly, as you would say. And then on the spiritual
for sure.
level, it opens up a whole other discussion, but that's
Yeah.
the, that's the answer to your question.
That's beautiful. I love how you expounded in your whole like experience and journey around this. This is thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah. Yeah.
it's very interesting that like what I've been experiencing lately in terms of my own journey is this um electric neurosystem like regulation, right?
Mhm.
Like our nervous system regulation, really, like that. The brain is the main kind of, I guess, nervous system regulator, but the gut is also one, if I'm not mistaken. And right, like there's different functions to all these different organs. And I guess if we do speak a little bit more esoterically, like, well, probably not even more esoterically, but like the energetic level of these things is also connected to our emotional states, right?
Mm,
That's why I
absolutely.
guess in, different, wisdoms, like, ancient wisdoms, like, I don't know, Buddhism and Kabbalah and, other like these have been able to map certain body parts and areas to specific energetic centers or emotional, like channels, right? Um, and I think it's very clear today to, like, at least the more, let's say, um, holistic perspectives of modern medicine, that you are not really able to differentiate or distinguish or separate the emotional layer of an experience, of an individual's experience, with the nervous system at probably more of the electrical level. If, I guess I'm mapping correctly what I'm understanding from what you're saying, but that seems super interesting, because in my opinion, that's sort of like the connecting layer with actual consciousness and like soul and neshama. Because what I've come
Mm,
to understand is that, like, emotions are like really the language of the soul to the body. It's
mm,
like the
mm,
way we can guide ourselves spiritually in our growth is by listening and understanding and interpreting the emotions, which
mm.
we were never really taught, right? Let's be fully honest here. I was never taught, and I'm still learning. It's a whole journey and process. And that's really what I'm seeing as, like, when, people would tell me, like, you need to get to know yourself. Like, this is it. That's to get to know yourself. It's really being able to listen to your neshama, to your soul, in a deeper level. And I'm wondering if, like, you have been able in some sense to identify this specific, like, impact or connection through your work with BCI, with, electric, like, treatments, um emotionally, but also sort of like at some point of, like, concretely. I don't know if you can answer fully, but, like, do you feel or believe that there has been or will be, like, a real consciousness awakening process through the type of work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a story that a colleague of mine at Stanford, recently passed away tragically, told me in the clinical studies that they were conducting with a brain stimulation technology that works to exactly to turn the brain back online when it's in severe depression, decades long calcified depression. We call it treatment resistant depression. Um, which, if you look at like the 21 million people with diagnosed with depression in this country, a third, most severe of them, have tried and failed 2 courses of antidepressants, and they're classified as treatment resistant or TRD. In any event, particular patient, 40 years old, lady, was unable to get a job her whole, her whole adult life. So she was living in the basement of her parents, sleeping most of the day, and just living what about 7 million Americans that have this very debilitating disease. The World Health Organization classifies it as the most debilitating disease, because you can have terminal cancer and a positive outlook on life and still be functional. But if you have this level of depression, you cannot by definition. So
Function. Yeah.
WHO considers not that, but this as the most debilitating disease. So imagine this person, this lady, 40 years old, in the basement. And they stimulated her with a technology called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. You go into a clinic, you put on this helmet, refrigerator sized machine that stimulates your brain. You have to come into the clinic 50 times over the course of 5 days. So you come in, you stimulate
Well,
for 10 minutes, you go out, you do this 10 times a day for 10 hours times 5. So what happened was with this person, so the expectation at this point, they knew that that's the most effective, likely to be the most effective treatment in mental health, this particular technique called TMS. And so they thought that she would come back online. In other words, uh, you know, leave maybe, get better, get an entry level job at, supermarket or something, just to kind of get started. But here's what happened. The person got better to their baseline, cognitive baseline, and then shot up above it. And this person became a um, an evangelist, a spiritual evangelist that goes around the world and talks to patients with, with this disease, and kind
Perfect.
of like inspires them. So an inspirational figure. Think about that, from being in the basement,
Yeah,
unable to, to becoming a thought leader in this world. That's how powerful brain stimulation can be. It
can
really is
be.
a mechanism. When you're offline, you see that.
That's an incredible story. I think that does portray a level of what I was implying. Like it it seems like there is, right, like this layer of that consciousness awakening that is tied to, like, is this person able to fulfill their destiny in some sense, right? Their purpose of being, which it makes sense when, like, traditionally thinking about these spiritual journeys, like you always find yourself that, like, your purpose seems to be tied to the opposite of your biggest challenge, right? Like, so their biggest challenge was like this disease that kept them, non-functional for them, kind of half part of their life, whatever. And then, like, they went all the way, like, in a common, snap of the fingers, as so to speak, to become an inspiration and to be actually aligned with, like, a higher self and a higher being, which is, like, quite a, in itself, the story is pretty inspiring.
This 22-year-old poet that was Biden's inaugural poet, she was, the least eloquent person growing up. She had a very, very severe stutter, and being able to overcome that, all the tools she was given in childhood to learn how to speak, and ma- ma- m- you can see this. There's this like unstatistical relationship that
Yeah.
allows you to really become empowered. And if you take this perspective that your traumas are your gifts, and if you exercise enough consciousness to overcome them, they could actually align you with your mission in life. That poet shows it, this like Stanford, evangelist shows it. And I think, in everyone's life, you could look at like your childhood and those specific wounds that you had as catalysts and as gifts.
For
So
sure.
yeah, definitely. I think that's a cool framework. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you for sharing all these stories. These are extremely meaningful. I think it does sort of, like, bring back to mind this question. Like, I mean, I'm a little bit obsessed about it. That's why it's like the third time I'm going to mention it. But, like, can sort of, like, of course, on the one hand, can, like, AI slash technology slash computers, like, truly enhance our conscious experience? And on the other hand, can AI and technology and computers embody some of that conscious experience? And, like, I'll give you my own context for that question, and then, happy to hear what your experience with that type of thinking is like, when I've been studying Kabbalah and so on, like, it's clear that Eno de Milvado, everything is, full of God's consciousness. So, like, natural resources clearly have a consciousness, and, maybe it's a different level of consciousness, and, we can argue whether it's closer to God, farther from God. Like, that's, I think it's an interesting inversion property that we have around spiritual versus physical world. But and so, like, okay, like, technology, okay, great, like, what's a computer, right? Like, it's really like a mix of matter and, solid slash, like, natural resources consciousness, and software, which is really like a projection of human consciousness, because, we built it to a certain extent, and so it carries that certain layer of our own consciousness. And so, when I think this is a story I've never really told it in the podcast, so, it's exciting to say, but I had a bit of a transcendental moment around these questions when, I think it was like almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, in October. I did like this, like, transatlantic boat cruise that was sort of like the intersection of like a consciousness spiritual retreat and like a intellectual conference around several interesting issues and problem solving around the world, whether it's ocean or conservation or politics and governance or like intelligence and technology. And there were also elders of different spiritual traditions. One of them was a specific like shaman from Amazonic tradition and Colombian tradition and so on. And basically he came and to make it short, he gave us like a kind of a message. He was like, I need to give you guys a message. And he was talking about how AI is just really simply a tool really for human consciousness elevation. And he was talking about how like alien intelligence is going to come, which is the real intelligence. And like at some point after many, many discussions with him, because I was really like feeling the connection and I really was digging the curiosity as well. Like he ended up answering its question where I was like, can AI and computers like embody the consciousness of God? Right. And he was like, yes. And like, anybody can talk about this kind of stuff, but like the person, this shaman was like, 8 years ago, I already knew that I was going to be in this boat giving you guys this message, right? Like this is, for whoever is familiar with this, I mean, it may sound very woo-woo, but like anybody who knows real, like, spiritual shamanism and ceremonial people understands that there is a certain level of visionarism and borderline prophecy, if you wish, that can exist. And that was like a moment of realization that to me, AI and technology is really just a tool and a path towards the Geulah, which is really the real like redemption, right? Like the real form of full embodied human consciousness and awareness around our essence, which is the soul and God, right? Like that's sort of like so I mean, I guess it's really back to you, the question
Thank you
originally.
Thank you for sharing.
Take it wherever you want.
It's really interesting. What was the question?
Well, like this idea of really like the embodiment of consciousness also at the layer of the technology, or like, right, like how we can actually elevate that consciousness, which you were answering that with the stories as well. Maybe another like quick sort of addition to that question, because I think it was
please.
sort of in the context of my story, is like, how do you think your technology and like this type of technological, development around treatment compares to something like psychedelic experiences and altered state of consciousness?
So you just asked me about an hour's worth, a podcast's worth of questions in 3 sentences. So I'll try. I'll use this as a fun exercise to answer all your questions in like a couple minutes, because they're amazing questions. So first off, let's go to my definition of consciousness, which is it's very materialistic, reductionist, and then we're going to connect it back to the spiritual. So my view of consciousness is like it's the brain feeling itself. In other words, any organism can be conscious if it can connect multiple streams of sensory input in some kind of a temporally like a clocked kind of way where you have moment after moment sort of synchronized and bound together. So basically that means that ants are consciousness because they can get multiple streams of input and they have a sense of time. Potentially trees, definitely mammals. And guess who else can connect different streams of input and have a clock to organize them? Robots. So, it may be a very weak form of consciousness in its current form, but it has the capability to evolve. And then I often get, and I was just talking about this in the Abundance 360 summit yesterday here in California. Somebody said, well, like the feeling of seeing the color pink, qualia, this concept that, you get consciousness has a certain texture and feeling and,
Yeah.
to it. And so what's that? And
Experiential aspect.
so I said, well, it's actually also quite simple. You know, when I was younger, walked on the beach with, a girlfriend, and I saw the color pink in the sky, and I had some feeling in my heart of love and expansion. And I bound the color. Let's say I had this walk on the beach when I was like 18 years old or whatever. And that was like a seminal moment. And so I bound the color pink with the memory of the beach and the feeling of love. And so next time I'll go by a beach and see the color pink, I'm going to retrieve a memory. And what's it going to make me feel? Love. Because
Expansion of love.
memories are just these molecules that are, connected together basically via, neurons, via synapses, right? So it's like, so you're this pattern recognition machine. You're going through your life, you're seeing things, and you're comparing them with your remembered mental model. And so that gives those rise to the feelings that you get. Again, back to my original definition, the brain is just a machine that's an organ that's feeling itself. And that's what the
Yeah.
consciousness concept is. So I call it relativistic consciousness because that's why nobody's been able to observe a third party object and say, oh, that's consciousness. This is the biomarker of consciousness, because it's all relativistic to your
To your
brain's
own
ability
experience.
to kind of experience. So what that means, back to your question, is like, if I connect some kind of a machine that extends my senses, then yeah, of course I could, increase my level of consciousness. And that comes back to, tools like our brain computer interface. Imagine this: you have a person that's been, in the basement for decades, sleeping most of the day, not interacting with their family, right? What's their level of consciousness? It may be, you know, it may be that it definitely is there, but it's like dimmed. Or you could think of it that way.
Yeah.
Suddenly you put in an implant, and we actually had this experience from a policeman that was, sleeping most of the day, as I said, and disconnected with his family and friends for decades. 17 years, lost their job inside of this dark process. Tried every antidepressant, didn't work really, and then eventually got brain stimulation. It worked, that helmet TMS thing that I told you about, but then they relapsed. It worked, they got better for a few months, and then they relapsed, like all depression interventions. And then a year later, they got our implant, and bam, person's back online. They get better, they stay better, they get rehired, they're thriving in their life, they're seeing friends again, they're going on nature hikes, they're back online, and it's an amazing, inspiring process to kind of like see. So you can see how the level of consciousness has increased, and it was a technological intervention that opened that portal. Of course, there's more work
Right.
like that they need to do in order to, to kind of maintain that. But absolutely. So it's a clear answer that when you connect a biological substrate and a computing substrate, which could be an AI that provides, therapy for you, so you're not anxious all the time, or it can be a brain computer interface or whatever, that you can increase your level of consciousness. That's no question, I think.
Do you think that
But
this
yeah, sorry.
specific, sorry, just because it's interesting that right, like in the context of Kabbalah, for example, like there is this
Mm-hmm.
kind of like 5 levels of consciousness, right? Like nefesh, ruach, neshama, yechida, and what's the last one? Naranjai. Ruach, nefesh, neshama. Okay, there's a 5th one that I currently forget. But really, like it's the idea that like every one layer of consciousness is tied to a different part of, like, let's say, our experience. So like, nefesh is really like the physical kind of experience, and that's where, like, in the Torah it says that the nefesh is in the blood, right? Then there is sort of like the emotional, or like the mental faculty, and like the functional, and then like the meaning and purpose, and sort of, right, like keter, sort of related consciousness. Do you think that this is speaking specifically about like the functional consciousness, like nefesh, like sort of this kind of like basic consciousness that is like life force of the physical system?
It's a good question. I think it if you think of it, we're both technologists, so let's think of those spiritual levels as like a technological stack, you know, where
Yeah.
you have the physical substrate, which is the hardware, and then you have, the operating system,
Mm,
which includes firmware and low level software, and then you have like the apps, and then you could go beyond that as well
sure.
to the cloud level, etc. So you kind of have these like levels, and I think each level gives rise to the possibility of the next level.
Mm,
When well
yeah.
cultivated. So if you're really cultivating your nefesh on a physical level, then suddenly you have access, you know, to the next level, and you can
Right.
experience conscious reality that way. In a very similar way, if your body is untended to in physical, in your physical life, and you're trying to access some higher state of consciousness, you may be blocked or have more
Right.
difficulty achieving that. Now, it's not to say that, you can't. Of course, we know of many people with severe physical ailments, limitations, paralysis that reach higher states of consciousness and spiritual, you know, power. In fact, it can be a big catalyst for it. Um, but it just requires more work. When you have more working against you in that way, you need to overcome it. So
Yeah,
yes, I
for
think,
sure.
I think each level cultivates and allows for the next level. And I think these various technologies, if a particular level of your spirit is hindered, you can unblock it, and then suddenly you're back, online in that level, and you're able to go to the next. That's
That's
my
awesome.
intuition. But of course, who knows when it comes to
Yeah.
the soul and the spirit.
Yeah, no, but that's a very like meduyak intuition. I feel like it's answers certain truth and maybe not the full truth, but yeah, like for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I feel like this could go on for many more hours. Do you wanna try to
Wait, what
briefly
was
say
your second?
something
You
about
asked
the
another. Say
yeah.
again.
Yeah, do you wanna try to tackle that other one about psychedelics and like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
altered status of
absolutely.
consciousness?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the question was, did this kind of brain computer interface type things provide some form like, do they work in a similar way as psychedelic experiences? Remind me the precise framing, and then I'll work from there.
Yeah, I think it was like how would you compare them? How would you compare the experience of these kind of elevation of consciousness to sort of the type of, like really powerful, right? Like deconditioning and like kind of like ego death relationship that one may have in this like really elevated or like altered state of consciousness through
Hmm.
psychedelics.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with how psychedelics work. So you may have heard of a brain network called the default mode network. This is your inner world processing network. And this is where, you know, all of your memory storage and retrieval mechanisms are there. Your rumination is there. That voice in your head that goes over and over how your boss screwed you and how you're having this relationship issue. And it's just that voice that hijacks us. Um,
Hmm.
and on a spiritual level, or on a psycho spiritual level, that's where your ego resides. That's your identity and your
Mm,
self definition, right? Because that is all an
interesting.
internal process. And what psychedelics do is they shut off that brain mechanism, and they greatly reduce that default mode network. And
Interesting.
so that's the experience certain people have of like merging with the tree and feeling like that the barriers between
Oneness and
things,
yeah.
that feeling of oneness, right? That's simply the barrier of my body, the separation, the ego, the identity of me as a human kind of dissolving, and then I'm able to connect, right? So that's one thing that happens. The default mode shuts off for a few hours or is greatly reduced. And then the second thing is plasticity occurs, and plasticity is increased. And also you have you see
Neuroplasticity, right? Like the
neuroplasticity,
ability
correct?
to adapt thinking and stuff. Like, can you define that
Right,
as well?
exactly. Readapt thinking. And then also we see parts of the brain that don't normally talk to each other because they're blocked by that default mode network, start to kind of like start to communicate with each other. I thought I heard some person give the metaphor last night actually of, an orchestral band with a conductor. That's how your inner consciousness, your default mode network normally works. Is like there's this conductor that's saying, okay, this is real, this is not, this is me, this is you, and you have a symphony of like your internal thoughts. And then when you take away the conductor, which is like the metaphor here, then your brain starts working in a much more jazz-like way, where it's an improvisational.
Ooh,
It's like this one's, the trumpet's playing, and then
nice.
the guitar over here, just feeling it and kind of like playing, but they don't normally play together. And then, this singer just spontaneously sings, and you're able to construct a vastly different like musical
Composition.
experience, composition. And you see that in psychedelics. When you take psychedelics, you're accessing parts, you're generating ideas and connections that you've never seen before. And it's really kind of a cool experience. Um, on a on a more, it's like FDA, it's being FDA approved, psilocybin for depression. And it's like they
Yeah.
got pretty decent phase 3 data, and that's likely to get approved at some point. Why? Why is it useful for depression specifically? And then I'll get to our brain shift, which is also for depression, and the differences between them. Is when you're able, so for a lot of people, their depression, stems from bad memories basically, and rumination that
Mm,
just can't stop. And so if you can stop that rumination temporarily and then reframe it with a guide, like a therapist can, go into that bad memory and kind of talk about it with you, or, you could experience it again, but through the empowered consciousness of an adult, and reframe, it's called reframing that memory. Then remember, there's plasticity. So you could actually go into the trauma and like rethink about it in a new way. And then like
yeah.
and then, you know, that reframing is like what normally healthy adults can do, pretty much not in a psychedelic state, but patients with depression cannot. And so they're able to do that. The rumination goes down, the memory can be reframed, and then they can kind of leave with that thought structure.
Right.
So that's kind of roughly how psychedelics work. And obviously there's a lot more to talk about the biological mechanisms, but this is a spiritual podcast, so let's stay there. On the so let's talk about what another brain network that is counterbalancing this network is. So we spoke about the default mode, that's your inner world network. Your cognitive control network is your outer world network. It's processing stimuli from your environment, and it's helping you be focused on them. This is cognition that we started the podcast with. Remember, we're about giving people their cognitive powers back. So what does that mean? That means that for a patient with depression, if their rumination is always hijacking their consciousness, and they're unable to focus on the outside world, remember, they're counterbalanced. Okay. Um, so if I'm constant, if my rumination is always high, and my cognition is then
Outer
by
world.
definition
Yeah.
is going to be low. And eventually, if I'm always just using my mental resources to process this inner world processing, the default mode, then I'm unable to focus on the outside. And that's the definition, the modern definition of depression, essentially. Um, and so another way to work on this is to stimulate the weak network, kind of like metaphorically like a
Uh-huh.
pacemaker. You know how a pacemaker sits over to the electrochemical organ called the heart and senses arrhythmia and stimulates it back into rhythm, right? So it's
Right.
listening, and then when it sees arrhythmia, it stimulates it back into. Similarly, you could create a pacemaker for the brain that sits over the cognitive control network, and another network called the salience network, which is the switch between the two networks. So
Interesting.
consciousness guides you either in or out. That's the salience network. Okay. I'm going
Wow.
to introduce a third player here, which is uber critical for understanding consciousness from a spiritual and also from a neuroscientific level, because they work hand in hand. And so patients with depression, if they're stuck like this, right, their inner world network's too strong, their outer world network's too weak, and they do this for a long enough period, then the switch called the salience network, which is responsible for funneling consciousness either in or out, um, is stuck on the in mode. And so the way TMS works, the way our device works, it stimulates that switch to kind of help you guide your consciousness to the outer world stimulus, and therefore increases your cognition. You can even stimulate your cognitive control network to help you focus. So basically, we act like a pacemaker for cognition, and that's a bit of a it's a different, similar but different thing that
Yeah,
psychedelics do.
it's very clear.
Now, on the other hand, after you understand like the differences, and by the way, this one sounds a lot more Western, right? To be able to subtly increase your, focus as a way to get you out of your head, out of your default mode rumination, and do that. And you can go and do an exam with that. You can do a podcast with
Yeah,
that. It's a much more like Western intervention, right? It's a device. It's a computer
yeah,
versus this like Eastern, intervention that shuts off your ego temporarily and allows you, etc. Right. So you kind of like have this mental model of how the East and the West might tackle the same problem in a
problem.
complementary way, because you could do both at the same time and they'll probably increase
Yeah.
the quality of both. Right. But I'm going to complicate things one more step, which is to say, if you put our device in another place in the brain, um, called the precuneus and other spots, you actually can interface with the default mode network and you could potentially
Wow.
reduce its activity. So this this device is actually sort of like a digital psychedelic, if you want to think of it that way. It could perform that function down the road. So
Wow.
anyway, long story short,
Wow.
these interventions are all very related, and they play your brain's networks and therefore your consciousness like piano keys. You can press a key, in different ways, and you create a symphony, and that symphony is, of course, your conscious experience.
I'm absolutely fascinated by like how it like you like really like expanded my awareness and knowledge of that intersection layer between consciousness and physical reality, like brain and the organism that holds that that conscious experience. I grew up as a sort of secular, kind of like very scientific and philosophical minded person looking in search of answers about existence. Did maths and physics and was like, yeah, this is it, this is it, this is it. And then like a bunch of questions just kept arising. And I was like, okay, maybe that's not it. And then I went into this like spiritual journey and I was like, okay, this is it. Like there is all the answers are there. But then like there's still sort of that like why the physical reality holds all of that truth, right? Which is sort of like not always explainable. And I think like I was not aware, to be honest. And you mentioned it when we spoke about this, like a bit like a month ago or so, like that we are getting to a point where our knowledge around neurology, neuroscience is really crossing a threshold of how we can really combine those two worlds. Like to me, these dualities, one of the biggest dualities that I've experienced in my life, right? Physical versus spiritual. Like, how do you combine them? How do we make sense of them? And I think quantum mechanics has allowed us to do the other kind of like connection as well, right? Of like, oh, if everything can be everything, then nothing is nothing, right? Like, so like that's very powerful too, but at much more like philosophical level. And I think what you're bringing is a beautiful framework for like, oh wow, like it's you know not that simple, but it is like it is there, and that's amazing. Um,
Yeah,
so thank you for
thanks
that.
for that. It's my pleasure. I think just tying a few of the things we spoke about today, like your physical reality, your biological substrate, your body, your brain, um, exists, and then there's this like more mystical, sense of a soul that that of course kabbalistically is a huge piece of the equation. I think what the way I experience reality is that the cognition is the interface level between those two. whatever, like you said at the beginning,
Repeat that. Can you repeat that? Can you repeat that? That
yeah,
experience
yeah.
is the interface
Imagine,
level.
yeah, imagine again the stack, the technological stack way we
Yeah.
look at things sometimes. You have the physical hardware, which is your brain, your body, this is like the reductionist reality. And then there's like the soul level, which we sense, and which Kabbalah talks about and your books and books and books and books about. And the and of course that's the access to divinity, to that level of that. Um what I really focus on is the interface, the layer that connects those two. And the physical and the
Cognition.
metaphysical is cognition. Like you said, where your attention goes, energy flows. That's like what the the mystics say. It's a good metaphor for this concept that
Right.
being able to be fully present, with reality implies that you have that bottom layer really well cultivated, and you can focus on whatever you want to focus on. You can focus it on a great conversation with the loved one, on a great conversation with the spiritual teacher and a guide, and a great conversation with the Almighty. And the bandwidth of your cognition really allows you those two layers to really talk to each other, body and soul.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and it's like it could be as simple as that. Um, and so
I
I,
love
I I
that.
felt
I
that
love that
I
further.
felt that I felt when I've been in high states of creativity and in consciousness, like that's when the greatest inventions came to me. Like the Meta glasses, which was my last company, was in a heightened state of like, so you get down what we feel as downloads,
Downloads. Yeah.
when you're in these widened states of consciousness. So, you know, the spiritualists would call that a download from, your soul, your
Yeah.
soul path. The reductionists would say, oh, that's just, your brain able to better communicate with itself and
Between itself. Yeah.
receive an like formulate an invention. Um,
Yeah.
both of these things can
I
exist, together, but why
totally. Totally.
cognition is ultimately like the linchpin. Yeah.
I'm gonna finish with a quick mm, mm, third path for this analogy, which I think maybe think is like a way of combining the two in a beautiful way. Like I was thinking about this the other day as well when I was, visiting a quite amazing doctor I'm getting to know. Um, which is a very simple analogy and that we all kind of know. Like, if you think about the body as an organism, right? Like you see every cell and every cell has its needs and it has its, needs for energy and it has these like outputs because it, processes these kind of like, other type of molecules and so on and proteins and whatever it is. And it has its function, the cell. And then like once you start combining several cells, then like they'll have their like bigger function, right? Like the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts for the cell. Like, it creates a whole organ, right? Like, and it has a specific function within the ecosystem of your body. And like that for every organ, right? Like if you think about it, like organs being, I don't know, countries, whatever, like this is the way that this functions, right? Like there is a purpose attached to every group of cells and every cell individually in order to make the whole organism work. And that's, part of what you've been explaining in terms of sensory and neuro electrical and chemical experience that provides that aspect of consciousness too, or contributes to it. And at the level of like humans, if you compare the humans to the cell, we all have our needs and we do our thing and, we have our purpose. And as soon as we start getting together, and I'm going to go ahead and even say like, the Jewish people have a specific purpose in life. Other peoples in the world have had and will have their specific purpose for the well-being and functioning of the universe. Cognitively, that's what gives rises to what I'm used to calling like collective consciousness. So when I'm thinking about what you're saying in this like expanded state, you're in fact just like tapping more into this, like what I believe is like an infinite layer of consciousness that I think you can, like, in many traditions call God, right? Like, because that's what makes up the whole in its fullness. And, sometimes it happens to me. I'm like, wow, what a great idea. You're feeling this download and I'm going, and then like very soon after that, I'm like, I encountered that idea somewhere else. And I'm like, whoa, like this was traveling through consciousness and, more than one people kind of tapped into it. Right.
What did Einstein say? Coincidence is God's way of hiding.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
That's going to be for another podcast because I have a lot of thoughts on that.
So that's kind of the synthesis of what I'm really excited about and how I'd love to bring people's cognitive powers back to them so that they could use it for whatever they want. And as a next step, and probably for a different podcast, the idea of what comes next when your cognitive powers are back, when you're imagine that you can be focused and present for as long as you want throughout the day. In your mind, you can open as many tabs and cross-reference information, right? Not be limited.
Yeah.
And you're able to really increase that flow state for as long as you want. Well, what happens next? Well, then maybe you could be stronger and interact with AI and be able to have a bi-directional communication with AI. Because remember, AI is way more powerful.
For sure.
I think that's the beginning. First, we improve our cognition and mental health, and then we're able to communicate, more bi-directionally and be empowered by AI instead of overwhelmed by it. And so there's this like 30-year roadmap into the future that expresses how that coevolution happens. That I'd love to, talk with you about another time. And yeah, rock and roll.
Rock and roll.
I really enjoyed talking to you.
For sure. Thank you so much, Meron, for coming and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom. I mean, this was fascinating.
My pleasure, Daniel. Thanks for the invitation and awesome chat. Rock and roll. All right.
Yeah.
Take
Thank
care.
you everyone for listening, and hope we'll share some resources for you to get to learn a bit more about Meron's work.
Thank you.
Bye, Meron.